Chapter 14. Gregory took the stairs 2 at a time on his way back down and bounced out happily on the sidewalk by where Wolf was standing and waiting for him. "This young mademoiselle of yours, she's tougher than she looks. 5 hours of German opera and she held up remarkably well, and still had energy left for smiles and friendly banter on the way out of the theater," said Wolf, as Gregory joined him, and the two began walking down the street into the night. "Yes, I am rather proud of her," admitted Gregory, realizing as he said it that he sounded like her parent. "You have certainly done much for this little seamstress," said Wolf. "You have brought a lot of magic and wonder into her life, like the opera tonight. Certainly these are the kinds of things that she would never be able to enjoy without you bringing them to her and sharing them with her. Your generosity is most becoming. And she is beautiful in a way that one does not expect at first. In a quiet kind of way, an understated way," continued Wolf thoughtfully. "Do you want to know what I was thinking of as I watched the two of you? That perhaps I'm a bit jealous of you. What you are doing may be unwise, but to have your exterior and to be able to still indulge in the unwise on any level must be wonderful. She makes you happy, yes?" "You can see that she does," said Gregory. "Then who am I to say that it will not work out in a way that we cannot yet imagine today? You have spent so many years in misery, my friend. Forget my earlier worries, then. I may just be a bitter old man who has seen too much and become too cynical about this world. Take this happiness and let it fill your heart with something fine to replace all of that mistrust and bitterness. To have a true friendship with someone is a blessing, no matter how unlikely the friendship may be or how short its duration, and I can see that your heart is truly set on this path," Wolf told him. Gregory felt himself touched by Wolf's kind words. He was also grateful that Wolf had not added any remarks again about who ending up in whose bed. "Yes, sometimes I'm afraid how it will all end too, Wolf," he thought, but he said nothing. "There was a special one for me also," said Wolf, gazing ahead into the pool of darkness between the streetlight behind them and the next streetlight yet to come. Down the Danube from Vienna, in what was then a part of Hungary, there is a fine old city with a castle up on the hill overlooking the river. And I met a young man who lived there. He looked a bit like you, perhaps not as tall, a bit leaner even, and he was the greatest violinist of the age. He was not famous, but many of the famous violinists believed him to be a great master. There was no one in my life like him, before or since. We spoke about music, about literature, about love, about God, about voyages that he hoped to take one day. In short, we spoke about everything. There were no secrets between us. As Aristotle wrote, truly great friendship is a single soul dwelling in 2 bodies. And we were like that. We were one soul. "Oh, what became of him?" asked Gregory. Wolf shrugged. "I never learned. I came to visit him many times, and then one day we had a terrible falling out, and that was that. It broke my heart to such a degree that it reshaped who I became. It was the wound from which I probably never entirely recovered. I loved others after him, but not like him. he stood alone in my affections, so deep inside of my heart that it was sometimes difficult to remember that he was a separate person from me. When he went away, it was as if I had lost something of myself, a great personal loss, and that city became for me a city full of memories. I got on the ship for the last time at that dock, looked up at the castle, swore to never return, and in all of this time I never have. When I am in Vienna, I sometimes think how close it is to go there, and I think that it would be sweet to glide down the Danube and see it all once again. But then I think about how it would still seem like a sepulchre to me to know that he who was once there with me is now long gone. Gregory had heard many of Wolf's stories over the years, but he had never heard this one. To think of Wolf as a young man with a passion for another person rather than for just a pile of leather binding and paper seemed very strange to him. "And are you certain he is gone?" Gregory asked. "Well, what else? I've never been back to look for him," said Wolf. "The way we parted was rather definitive." "I'm sorry," said Gregory. "That must be a painful memory." "Yes, it is. But at the same time, anyone who has truly been in love like that will understand that it is difficult to ever look back and regret it. You wish for a different ending, but you would never wish to avoid the pain, since then you would have to avoid all of the glory of the friendship that went with it. Ah, but enough with long bygone melancholy. Which direction will you be taking from here, so that I can take the other?" asked Wolf. Actually, I already went out. I will be retiring for the night, probably to my study to do some writing," replied Gregory. "Oh, this is an improvement in your level of self-care, isn't it? You are careful now to always—" began Wolf. Gregory cut him off. "She prefers it when my hands are warm, so I do what I can to oblige." "I understand," said Wolf. "One of the sweetest experiences that love offers to the lover is the near holy actions taken in service to one's beloved, of which the beloved may not even be fully aware." "It is hard for me to reconcile some of my actions with holiness, but I understand your meaning," replied Gregory. "To do or not to do that which represents a sacrifice in the name of love is sweet, but it also has an element of raw fire to it." "Ja, genau. That is to say, exactly," said Wolf. "Well, I will go left here then, and you go home and enjoy the evening, my son." Gregory hurried home, hung up his suit jacket, took off his vest, untied his tie, and draped it over his armchair. He poured himself a glass of red wine, which he knew would not make him feel too wonderful in his stomach later, as it was more difficult to digest than bourbon. But the taste of it going over his tongue would presumably make up for it. And then he went into his study and sat down to his journal. There had been so much to write about recently, and now there was this afternoon and evening to cover as well. He could still feel a tingle in his fingertips as he recalled sitting here on his sofa with her, his hands in her hair, something which he loved best of all, and telling her the story of Tristan and Isolde. To speak to the one you love about love was like drinking absinthe while out dancing with a beautiful woman. Thrilling, sensual, and almost just satisfying. He had felt her start to get caught up in his tale, felt her heart thudding in her chest as if he had his hands right on the other side of her ribs, and had almost died of the glory of it when she climbed up into his lap, seemingly unawares, and rested her ear against his chest. Over the years, many women had told him that his voice sounded wonderful to them, but this was a compliment on an entirely different level. She was clearly entranced, and it made him feel both powerful and awestruck to know that he could have this effect on her. Not wanting to frighten her, he had hesitated for a long while before putting his arms carefully around her shoulders. Then at last he had, and it felt exactly as perfect as he thought it might. Feel protected, he thought. Feel nothing but safe and protected. He thought his heart would pour out of him in that moment. There had never been a happiness in him as profound as the one that he could reach with her. And he suddenly believed that if he could just hold on to her forever, unrealistic as that was, that he would never hurt inside again. When had he fallen so completely in love with her, this half-child? When had she so upended his world? When had he, unaccustomed as he had become to social intercourse with such atrophied social skills, become an extender of dinner and theater invitations, or sat with someone in his parlor and told stories he had read in his childhood? When had his usual level of ongoing despair subsided and given way to this sudden renewed faith in love and in the world? Falling in love with Vivian was like a dam breaking, and now the emotion was tearing through his sad and careful life, sweeping in with it massive change. If you keep on living, Vivi, he had written in his journal, one day you will be as old as me, and then one day you may hit a similar place in your life, and you may discover the huge complexity of emotion that something like this causes. You see this young creature, still so innocent and full of faith in life, and you look at yourself and feel awful. You feel guilty, and you feel really very old all of a sudden. You feel bouncy and irritable by turns. You want to run away from this feeling. You want to run towards it. You look at this person and maybe see yourself in days past, and you wonder what she thinks, looking at you, who is farther on the road into the future than she is. I cannot and do not want to try to put this into words. It is a life collision of epic proportions. My love, I think of a million things that I would want to do to make you happier, and I have to fight the overwhelming urge to put them all into action. I remind myself 1,000 times a day that there is a line, and I cannot cross it, that we are not wed, and I cannot do all things for you that I would wish, that there are things I must not do for you. But inside, I am in fact just waiting for a sign to point me in the direction of a dragon that I could slay on your behalf. You may think of me as an angel, but for me, I have long thought of myself as the medieval knight. Like him, I have a highly overdeveloped bedrock of responsibility, always ready to fight some kind of injustice, always ready to defend someone's honor, always ready to die for some ideal or even idea. I hold myself to unattainably high standards that I cannot possibly meet, and then that creates a lot of internal pressure within me. Ah, how well I know it, that this is that same unhelpful, extreme caring that gets me into so many scrapes. I suppose life is trying to teach me the same things over and over again, and will continue to do so until I learn the lesson. Teach me, then, to care less, and to want to give and do less. He looked up from the page. Wolf had spoken of the inevitability of what Vivian would want out of the relationship. But what did Gregory really want? I think what I really want, he continued writing, is to have no space of any kind between us. Perfect alignment of thought, of opinion, of mood, and of trust. Vivian, I want to promise you, if everything else in your life fails you, you know without hesitation that I will always be here, on your side, ready to believe without evidence, ready to stand next to you and to fight whatever injustice has arisen. I want a tie between us that is unshakable and unquestionable, even if it is unusual and unfathomable. The kind of tie that can't be explained in words to anyone. A loyalty of the first degree, if you will. I won't settle for anything less with you. Loyalty of the first degree. Why so many words, when a simple and perfectly good word for this state already exists? A word that even you have found yourself brave enough to speak out loud to me. Why do I hesitate? Perhaps I don't want to cheapen the preciousness of what is within me by rushing to label it like this. I'm deeply serious about you, you see. When you return home while I sit here and write about you, or is it more accurate to say that I write to you, then I realize that I am not only there with you when I am in person, but also in spirit I am always there, wherever you are, because we overlap together and there is no way around it. And if you tell me that there is a perfectly good word for this, then perhaps one day I will be bold enough to also speak it aloud to you, to drop it into your waiting ears, and to listen as its magic goes to work on your vulnerable heart. When had been the last time he had told someone that he loved her? He tried his best to remember, but it was futile. He had no recollection of it at all. It must have been years and years ago. He closed his eyes and sighed. He put down his journal, finished his glass of wine, and then began writing anew, catching up about the evening and the performance of Tristan and Isolde. Kissing her hand was a sacred act, and giving her his warm hand was in fact many gifts to her in one, although she could not hope to know it. What a wonder it was to have these moments with her, these opportunities to have her close and to savor her nearness. What bad thing could ever touch them as long as they could be together like this? He dropped happily into his daydreams and imagined a string of chaste, passionate, intimate moments with her, stretching from this time into the far future. On his next visit to see Vivian and her mother, He mentioned to Vivian that she might perhaps come and visit at the store again, an idea that she happily agreed to. Unlike on the previous occasion, this time he wrote down the date and time in his pocket notebook so that it would not be a surprise. It so happened that Wolf was out when Vivian came in. She had his copy of Cyrano with her and returned it to him with a smile and a thank you. "How did you like it?" he asked her. "Very much," she replied politely. "I was wondering, though, if all of the stories you like have sad endings." Gregory thought about this for a moment. "I'd never thought of it that way, but perhaps you are right," he said. "Love that easily works out is for beginners, no?" He smiled back at her. "There is something that I want to do, have wanted to do for a while with you," he began. "Will you do as I ask?" "Well, that depends on what you will ask," she replied, ever cautious and practical. "None of this 'that depends,' please," countered Gregory. "Make me happy just this once. Just do it. Come and stand by the store window. There, good. Now turn your back to me, and I will read something to you." Vivian walked over to the window and stood looking out of it as he had asked. Gregory flipped through the book until he found the page he wanted. And then he took a deep breath and began to read to Vivian's delicate back and into the dark shadow of her hair against the brightness of the window. Not seeing her face only heightened for him the emotional undertones in the situation. "Let me enjoy this one moment, my one chance to speak to you unseen. Night making all things dimly beautiful, one veil over us both. You only see the darkness of a long cloak in the gloom, and I, the whiteness of a summer gown. You are all light. I am all shadow. How can you know what this moment means to me? If I was ever eloquent. Yes, I am all shadow," he thought. "The darkness of a long cloak in the gloom while you shine like a star." As he read, his voice swelled with all of the passion that he felt for her, but could not yet loosen into their world, all of the restraint for once left behind, feeling like Cyrano, suddenly free for the first time to be able to speak what was truly in his heart. His hands shook, and he was glad that her back was turned, that she did not see this excess of emotion that was sweeping him headlong toward a disclosure of his feelings, toward a declaration of love. "I never look at you, but there's some new virtue born in me, some new courage. Do you begin to understand a little? Can you feel my soul there in the darkness breathe on you? Oh, but tonight, now, I dare say these things. To you, and you hear them. It is too much. In my most sweet and unreasonable dreams, I have not hoped for this. Now let me die, having lived. It is my own voice, mine, my own, that makes you tremble there in the green gloom above me. For you do tremble. As a blossom among the leaves, you tremble, and I can feel all the way down along these jasmine branches, whether you will or no, the passion of you trembling." Everything in the room seemed to hold entirely still. Vivian had apparently stopped breathing. Gregory's heart was suddenly pounding as if he had been running at full speed for a full hour. He felt himself closing in on her, as if he had been chasing her down through the streets of New Orleans for a long while now, and here it was, the thrill of impending satisfaction so near now, at the end of the chase. Her back was even turned to him, vulnerable and unaware. The danger inherent in the situation began to unfold, and he was enthralled by it. Still holding the book open, he placed the fingertips of his free hand against her back and felt her move in surprise beneath him, as if he had run an electric current into her. He went on reading, feeling as if his soul was leaving his body with each word. And then Roxane replied, "Yes, I do tremble, and I weep, and I love you, and I am yours, and you have made me thus." Gregory was silent for a long moment and then asked, "Tell me truly, beloved, is that not a declaration of love to end all declarations?" His question came out of him in a low whisper, carried on a single breath, heavy with all of the desire that he had not yet dared to speak. Within his own heart, it was as intimate as anything he had ever experienced. He moved his hand to her right shoulder and rested it there, letting some weight come into it now, and feeling her rise up to meet it, accepting him there, bearing this small burden of him, coming to rest on her as if he were a bird who had suddenly landed on her collarbone. Time broke. All at once, to their left, the front door of the store creaked open, making them both jump. Gregory dropped his hand away. It was Volve. "Ah, my children, enjoying the view of New Orleans here from my shop window?" he asked with a smile. "We have been reading Cyrano de Bergerac," explained Vivian, in a slightly shaky voice. "Ach, natürlich. Let me see. Surely the scene with the soldiers of Gascony at war, right? Listen to the music, O Gascons. 'Tis not the fife of the army camp now, but the flute of the woods. Not the call to combat, but the love song of the wandering goat herds. Listen, O Gascons, to the sweet music of home." And then some rot about homesickness being a nobler hunger than that for food. Yes, he was a fine one, this Cyrano. Fräulein Prevet, you can be certain that Gregor is sharing with you the very best that world literature has to offer in overblown sentimentality. Wolf carefully set a bundle of books onto the store counter and walked behind it. "Back at home in Vienna, I believe they called it schmaltz." Gregory shut the book and shrugged. "I suppose there are books and plays for every palate. Vivian, you may feel free to accept or reject Cyrano as you see fit." Vivian turned all the way around to face him now, and the look in her eyes was that of soft starlight and the warmth of true affection. "It just so happens that I find Cyrano to suit me just fine," she replied with a smile. Gregory smiled back at her, and the two of them began to laugh together, a release of the tension that had only recently been built up between them by his reading. "Well now, will you two be going out, or shall I put you both to work reorganizing the supply closet?" asked Wolf. "Oh, we had not made up our minds, but when you put it that way, it certainly seems like an afternoon about town would be preferable," said Gregory. "Vivi, what do you think? We still have another hour until your mother expects us back. I'm thinking it has been some time since we had coffee and beignets." Vivian clapped her hands excitedly. "What a grand idea! Now that you mention it, perhaps they still have my crutches. You know I left them there when we first met for coffee?" "I hadn't realized that," said Gregory, surprised. "Well, You certainly do not need them any more." "No, indeed," said Vivian happily, turning a small and elegant pirouette in the middle of the store. Even Wolf could not help but smile along. "Then let's be on our way," said Gregory, tucking his book under his arm and opening the door for her. "Thank you for the few hours off," he called back to Wolf. Wolf just waved him away with his hand, indicating that they should go already and enjoy their hour of time. Since they had first met there, the Café du Monde had taken on a new aspect in Gregory's mind, and he never passed it now without looking over and scanning the tables out under the awning or behind the front window, as if waiting to see Vivian sitting there in her blue summer dress. "Do you remember when we first sat here together?" he asked, as they waited for their coffees and her beignets. "How could I ever forget it?" asked Vivian. "I wrote down everything we spoke about," he admitted. "Don't ask me now exactly what that was, but I do have it written down, in case you ever want to know later." "You told me about Thibodeau," said Vivian. "Remember?" "No, but that seems reasonable," he replied. "Speaking of Thibodeau, would you like to go there with me again? Mr. and Mrs. Mullins would be very glad to see you once more." "With or without my mother?" asked Vivian coyly. "Without," he said, definitively and without hesitation. They both looked at each other and smiled. The waitress returned with their coffees and placed the plate of beignets between them. Vivian pulled it over to her side of the table and took a giant bite, powdered sugar falling everywhere. "Well, this is rather messy," she said through a mouth full of fried dough. "Now I know the true reason you do not eat these. All of this powdered sugar would make a mess of your dark suit and your tie." Gregory laughed. "Well, it would certainly require a brush to put everything back in order before being seen on the streets again." "Do you want to know what I wondered when we sat here together last summer?" she asked him. "What did you wonder?" he asked her with a smile. "Well, everyone was wearing his or her lightest, most cool clothing to fight against the heat. But you wore what you always wear, a dark suit. You were the only man within sight distance in a dark suit. Why is that?" She turned the half-eaten beignet in her fingers to look for the best place to sink her teeth into next. He hesitated. How much to say? "Well, the seasons change, but night is always the same color," he told her finally. She gave him the puzzled look that he fully expected. "I mean, I do not sleep much. I do not sleep well, and I'm often out at night and walking. It is easiest to walk at night when you can blend into the shadows. Then you can avoid being bothered by people you do not wish to be bothered by, and in fact, once you get good at it, you can pass almost undetected through the streets." She gave him a long look without saying anything, and he could see her thinking. He wondered if he had said too much. Then she finished her bite of beignet, swallowed, and said, "It must also be helpful, then, to be able to move without making any sound." He stopped breathing and looked at her, suddenly very uneasy of where this conversation would go next, although he had been the one to push them out into these uncharted waters. She was smart, as he knew she was. But even so, how had they gotten here without his being able to help it within 2 or 3 sentences of safe and regular discourse? "You are right," he finally said in a low voice, feeling his earlier smile entirely wiped away. "To move without making any sound is then most helpful." "So when I'm asleep at night, you are mostly out?" she asked cautiously. "No, I would not say that. Over the years I have become what you might call a homebody. And I look forward to sitting in my parlor or my study and reading or writing or listening to music or daydreaming," he said. "What else do you do when you are at home?" she wanted to know. "Well, I enjoy taking long hot baths. A rather unmanly habit, I realize. You would expect a rugged man to splash ice-cold water on himself and scrub at himself with a rough bristled brush, I suppose. But I would almost rather not bathe than to get involved in any way with ice-cold water." Vivian brushed her fingertips against her napkin and blushed. "What are you thinking of?" he asked her, curious to know. "You coming out of a long hot bath and putting on your striped pajamas," she admitted. Gregory laughed. "Yes, let us not let anyone else know that you have seen my pajamas, or it will be difficult to explain." "Oh, but it is different now, isn't it, Vivi, than when we were here last summer?" "Different, yes, but mostly even more wonderful," she told him, and his heart squeezed happily in his chest for her. She seemed contented to let their earlier topic conclude for the time being, and he had the same feeling that he had had when she was defending his non-eating, that she was doing him a favor. "Also, we can now sit here and talk together without any worries about whether my mother will happen to come by and kill us." "Certainly an added benefit," he agreed, nodding. "You went to a lot of trouble for me," she said slowly, looking up at him earnestly. "You were worth it," he said simply. He opened his palm and reached his hand across the small table. She put her fingers into his and let him close his hand around hers. He wanted to never let her go again, but then looked at the plate of beignets and realized that it would be easier for her to eat with both hands free. So he gave her a friendly squeeze, reluctantly let her go again, and withdrew his hand. He pulled out his pocket watch to check the time. "Time to toss back the pastries at a more rapid speed, I fear. Your mother will be pacing the parlor soon," he said. Every good moment between them had to end so quickly, he realized. Sure, it was a lovely thing to now be able to be alone with her sometimes. But what would it take to be able to have her for himself for hours at a stretch? To not have to take 2 hours here and there and try to make a feast out of them. What would it be like if she were his? Could he put her to bed in his bed and tenderly pull up the covers around her one day, then go out, and then come back and ease himself into bed beside her and hold her close without suffering too much? Could he go to the grocery store and buy her eggs and make her breakfast? How were eggs cooked again? Well, someone must know and could tell him. Could she spend the days lying sensuously across his lap like a cat, wearing only his striped pajamas, her bare feet touching the end of his sofa? Perhaps he could teach her to drink bourbon. In his mind, he could see her sitting beside him on the sofa, and him passing her his tumbler, releasing the glass into her waiting fingers, letting her take a sip, reaching out his hand to take it back from her, and taking a sip himself. No hurry, no racing with clocks, no squeezing the last blissful minute out of every rendezvous. Just contentment without end with her. "Gregory," she said, reaching a hand over and tugging on his sleeve. Oh, this gesture that he had so come to love. "Gregory, I have eaten all the beignets. Stop dreaming with your eyes open and let's go." He looked over and saw the empty plate covered with powdered sugar. He looked up at her, and sure enough, there it was, on the end of her nose as well. He reached out his hand and gently brushed the sugar off of her. "This I do remember," he said tenderly. and they both smiled at each other like two idiots until the waitress came back with the check. Getting Vivian's mother to agree to an unsupervised day trip to Thibodeau was tricky, but Gregory was confident that he could ultimately get what he wanted. He began by mentioning that Mr. and Mrs. Mullins were happy to invite Vivian to join them again for lunch, and that he wanted to combine the trip with a ride on horseback to a nearby estate, where there might be some 19th century bound books for sale that Wolf might want him to investigate. If Vivian was willing to ride with him again, then it would be a nice trip for two, and it could be a pleasant day. Vivian's mother frowned and asked her daughter if she was willing to contemplate another ride on horseback with Mr. Morgan. Vivian blushed delicately like a rose, and then stepped up to the occasion with her battle-worthy wit and stated that she would have to reconsider if the same knickerbocker pants of unknown origin from last time would be foisted upon her again. Her mother sighed and said that the wearing of unstylish pants should be the least of Vivian's worries, that this afternoon out seemed like a bad idea and was in very dubious taste. A bit of cautious probing yielded the additional information that Madame Prevet was most worried about her daughter being seen at the New Orleans train station, boarding a train with an unknown man. Gregory assured her that, as it happened, he would be traveling out to Thibodeau a day earlier, and would thus not meet Vivian until she reached the train station in Shriever, where he and Mr. Mullins both would be waiting for her with the carriage. Vivian would then be able to have lunch with the Mullins and have her choice of riding trousers that she could change into in the comfort of the Mullins home. Vivian would be home by evening, and it would not be too late, so that she could comfortably get from the train station to the apartment without an escort and before dark. With all logistical matters thus arranged, Vivian's mother gave her reluctant approval. It was a day of paradise, sunny and full of early spring, and even years later, Gregory could bring scenes of that day readily to mind. He dressed with care, chased old Mullins out to the train station well in advance of the 10:20 morning train from New Orleans, and then impatiently walked the platform until Vivian's train arrived, and her graceful, girlish step carried her out of it. He felt the wild desire to pick her up in his arms and spin around in ecstatic circles with her, as if she were still 6 years old and barefoot, just a small child and wearing only her white hospital nightgown. Vivian greeted him happily, and then they went over to greet old Mullins. Gregory could tell that old Mullins liked Vivian, but that he was curious about her. Gregory had never brought a young lady to Thibodeau, at least not in old Mullins' memory, thought Gregory. Or maybe there had been one once. Well, since old Mullins was ancient, presumably his memory was not much better than Gregory's, so it probably made no difference either way. Vivian, Gregory, and old Mullins climbed onto the small old carriage and headed out towards the farm. Gregory thought that the countryside, as they passed through it, was the most beautiful it had ever been. It was the cool of March, but fresh sunlight poured through everything and made it seem much like late spring. He could see that even Vivian's breath was taken away by the whole thing. When they pulled up in front of the grouping of small buildings that made up the farm, such as it was, Mrs. Mullins came out to greet them. She did not seem at all surprised to see Vivian again, and Gregory wondered, not for the first time, what had passed between Vivian and Mrs. Mullins when the two had gone into the kitchen together briefly during Vivian's previous visit. It made him a bit uneasy, but then he told himself that the Mullins were loyal and stalwart supporters of his, and that he should not worry that they would set Vivian in any way against him. Lunch was agreed upon for noon, and then he and Vivian walked over to the horse stables to greet D'Artagnan. Last time you would not show us how well you ride, Vivian reminded Gregory, as she ran her hand along D'Artagnan's smooth neck. That is true. I did not want to have your mother think I am entirely a dandy who has done nothing with himself besides learning how to ride well, Gregory said. I will not think ill of you if you show me that you are as brilliant of a horseman as I believe you are, replied Vivian teasingly, still caressing the horse. Very well, then, said Gregory, reaching for D'Artagnan's saddle. For the record, I want it to be known that I feel decidedly foolish, though. I want to watch you, said Vivian, turning to face him. Her tone caught him off guard. He did not entirely approve of the way she said it. Ever since she had staggered into his apartment drunk, he was constantly on the lookout for a sign that she was leaving childhood behind, as Wolf had suggested. He looked into her eyes for a clue as to what she was thinking, but she just smiled, and then the sparkle that came into her eyes disarmed him. Let her enjoy this day, he thought. It was all for her anyway. Vivian stepped back so that he could saddle up D'Artagnan, and then Gregory walked the horse out of the stable. And then when everything was in place, not wanting to disappoint wide-eyed Vivian, he swung himself up into the saddle with all the verve of Zorro, whom he knew Vivian admired on the silver screen. He directed D'Artagnan to the right, where there was a wide meadow, and started in on a light canter, but it was as if the horse also felt Vivian's gaze, and now wanted to show off for her. D'Artagnan shook his head and pulled against Gregory, wanting to run. You should be ashamed of yourself, thought Gregory, not entirely sure in that moment if he really meant only the horse or also himself. In either case, he leaned forward over D'Artagnan's mane, touched his boots against the horse's flank, and they flew across the grass like an arrow released from a bow. Although Vivian was standing at the edge of the meadow, he somehow had the feeling all of a sudden that she was with him, was inside of him, all along his arms and legs as he pushed himself forward, full of a breathless energy, in the act of transitioning all intention and desire into pure forward motion. The wind that ripped past them as D'Artagnan ran was like a voice speaking to them, encouraging both horse and rider to go faster. They made a series of brisk loops around the meadow, and then Gregory pulled up the reins and slowed D'Artagnan down. The horse reluctantly obliged, and then they made their way over to where Vivian was standing. She was jumping up and down, laughing happily, and applauding. Gregory looked down from the saddle at her. My God, but she was such a small thing. Satisfied, mademoiselle? He asked. No, she laughed. I just want to keep watching you all day. You are magnificent. The horse does all the work, but I'm the one who is magnificent. I like your way of thinking, he said. Well, all right. D'Artagnan is magnificent too, she conceded. Gregory jumped down and handed Vivian the reins. Want to walk him back to the stable, then? Vivian looked uncertain. Don't worry, he will behave himself for you. In fact, I think he is very eager to please you. We are of one mind there, he thought, with a smile. Vivian still looked uncertain, but she took the reins. They walked back to the stables together, where the other horses all looked over and made whinnying noises as they saw the returning party. Gregory carefully looked after D'Artagnan while Vivian watched. Then Gregory told a story of how he had come to buy D'Artagnan a few years ago, and then they made their way back to the house, where Mrs. Mullins was getting lunch onto the table. Fried chicken, biscuits, and beans. Vivian helped to bring everything to the dining room, asked Gregory if she could bring him a glass of wine, and scampered away happily when he told her that she could. The strong, unwavering smile that she gave him while Mrs. Mullins loaded up Vivian's plate with huge helpings of everything could only be described as an act of love. Beloved, the Mullins have not seen me eat for years now, he thought. No need to chatter like a bird to distract them from any discomfort. Nonetheless, it was sweet evidence of her concern for him, and as such it worked its magic, bringing him to that slightly out of focus, happy feeling that one glass of wine alone generally did not have the ability to achieve. Old Mullins and his wife asked Vivian about her mother, what they had been keeping themselves busy with, and other small talk. Vivian told him about her visits to the theater with Gregory, and her delight at being invited back to see them at the farm. To see everyone all talking and having lunch together filled Gregory with a kind of domestic happiness that was so rare in his world, but that he had come to feel several times now, since Vivian had come into his life. He wondered, for the 1000th time, if this was what normal, everyday people felt like while living their normal, everyday lives. How simple, but yet how sweet it was. Dessert was peach cobbler, made with canned peaches that Mrs. Mullins had pulled out of the pantry. Gregory vaguely remembered a 6-year-old Vivian eating a peach and savoring it thoroughly. Or had it been an apple? In any case, this cobbler was gone almost before it touched her plate, and both old Mullins and his wife laughed good-naturedly at Vivian's appetite. Gregory sat and watched them, feeling his eyes half closing with contentment. But then he suddenly thought how he did not want to have anyone imagine that he was looking at Vivian the way a lion might look at its prey, so he looked away. Vivian was explaining about the 5-hour opera, and Mrs. Mullins was saying that she was certain Mr. Mullins would rather push the farm cart from behind from here to Bourbon Street than to have to live through such a thing. Old Mullins muttered some kind of mild protest, but no one believed him, and then everyone laughed again. I think what is most interesting is how different your two lives are, Mr. Morgan, said Vivian. Which 2 lives do you mean? Asked Gregory. Oh, beloved, if you only knew how many different lives I have already lived, he thought, and I am certainly living more than just 2 right now. I mean your life as New Orleans' finest theater-goer, as compared to your life as the rider of horses here at the Mullins farm, replied Vivian. Ah, but you are forgetting about the life where I am a bookshop delivery boy on a bicycle, Gregory said. Vivian pretended to frown. That one I don't care for as much. That delivery boy rode me down last summer, you will remember. What's this? Asked Mrs. Mullins. Vivian told them the story of how she had met Gregory, judiciously leaving out the bit about how this was, in fact, their second meeting. Good girl, he thought. I need someone who can keep secrets. Mrs. Mullins seemed suitably impressed. That is in itself like something out of an opera. What was it like to wake up one morning in the hospital and to find Mr. Morgan there? More than slightly disconcerting, said Vivian. You must realize that I was in quite a lot of discomfort at the time, when suddenly there appeared the man who had caused the accident. I think I was very bitter about it. Yes, I think so too, judging from the fact that I believe you called me a skunk, said Gregory teasingly. Me call you a skunk? I'm quite certain that I would have done no such thing, retorted Vivian. Moreover, your memory is not the best, right? Perhaps you are thinking of someone else? Everyone laughed. Mademoiselle Vivian was inadvertently given a sedative intended for another patient, and the result was quite humorous, explained Gregory to the Mullins. You may want to pretend otherwise today, but in that moment, I rather think that the sedative paved the way towards our friendship. So you should not be all that sore about it. Vivian thought about this and then smiled happily. Then all is good, she said. Vivian helped Mrs. Mullins clear the table, while old Mullins announced his intention to chop some more firewood from a tree that had recently fallen on the property. Once everything was put away, Vivian came back to Gregory and asked what they would do next. "Would you like to go for that ride?" he asked her. "Perhaps we should do it in another half an hour. That cobbler is still somewhere just under my ribs, I think," she told him. "Can I go and see your cottage? I wanted to see it last time, but didn't dare." "If you wish," he told her. They walked outside and across the lawn. It did not take long and they arrived at his small old cottage, with the weather-beaten, unpainted boards and its narrow porch with the one old rocking chair. He stopped and indicated that she was to go in. She ran up the steps and opened the door. Then she turned around. "You aren't coming?" she asked. "No," he replied. "Why?" she asked, frowning. She came back to stand beside him. "Be alone with you in my bedroom? Don't tempt me, Vivian." As he said it, she flinched. He didn't mean for it to come out quite so roughly. He looked down at her and saw her crestfallen expression. "Now don't go being all upset," he said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "But do think a bit. Do we need the Mullins to see you and me going into my cottage together, whatever the reason? I may be unwise enough to have invited you out for coffee once without a chaperone, but your mother will be glad to know that I'm not that unwise. And after all, it is possibly only through goodness, where we can achieve it, that our guardian angels stay loyal to us in our times of trouble. I will not risk our friendship on this." Vivian bit her lip and looked down at their shoes, something that he had often seen her do when she was very uncomfortable. She was so childlike. He was certain that she did not yet know what she desired. For him, meanwhile, all desires had long ago become one desire. Oh, Vivian, Vivian. When she met his gaze again a few moments later, he was surprised to see anger there. "I understand, but I hate it. I hate it. Why does it always feel like there's something between us that keeps us further apart than I want to be?" He had to fight hard to keep from kissing her. "Because there is, dear one," he told her gruffly. "Mostly it is the law of decency. Sometimes it is social expectation. And sometimes, I confess, it is my own fear." He turned his back and began walking across the lawn. "Go in, take a quick nap. When you are finished going over the place, as I am sure is your plan, I will be out that way, chopping wood with old Mullins. Just leave my things in my luggage alone, please." He strode across the grass, with perhaps a more impassioned stride than he meant to use, upset with himself suddenly that he had been so transparent with her, and told her more than he had intended to. If she was a good secret keeper, then he was rather a terrible one, which was unfortunate, since he had real secrets that needed keeping. He thought of her walking into the one small room behind that porch that served as his bedroom, hesitant but curious. He thought of her touching his bedding, thought of her lying down on his pillow and curling up her small body in the middle of his bed. It seemed to him suddenly as if he was the bed, and could feel the light burden of her weight as she sat down on the edge of it to remove her shoes, could feel her shifting about as she had in his arms that night that she had slept on his sofa. He felt lightheaded and shook himself, but this was an attack of desire and tenderness that he could not stop. Yes, chopping wood was exactly what would cure this, he thought ruefully. He turned the corner around the Mullins house and followed down the worn footpath cleared in the grass until he reached the area of the back lawn where old Mullins was chopping the fallen tree. "Here, let me help for a bit," said Gregory, removing his jacket, laying it down across a nearby bush, and unbuttoning his shirt sleeves and rolling them up. Old Mullins turned around, surprised. This was understandable, since Gregory only engaged in manual labor about 2 times a year. "Where is Miss Vivian?" Old Mullins asked. "I believe she is resting for a bit. Apparently she did not have as much stamina as was needed to be able to withstand the powerful sedative effects of that much peach cobbler," replied Gregory. Old Mullins just nodded and swung his axe again. Gregory found himself a second axe and got to work. There was a time in his youth when the chopping of wood would have provided a satisfyingly tiring physical activity for Gregory. But those days were long since past. It would take a long time like this to get to anything approaching exhaustion, he quickly realized. But at least he was outside and had something to do, and was helping Old Mullins. As with most hands-on skills, Gregory was not particularly good at chopping wood, but Old Mullins was too polite to comment on the inconsistent size of the cut timber, so Gregory kept at it. It took about 20 minutes for Vivian to reappear. She was wearing the new pair of riding trousers that he had gotten for her and left in his cottage to give to her. Apparently she had figured out that they were for her. Slender and perfect, she took his breath away. It appeared that she may have stood there for a while before he noticed her. He lowered the axe and leaned against it. He may as well give up. What was the point? There was not enough wood chopping in the world to take the agonizing sweetness out of looking at her. "You look like a real horsewoman," he told her proudly. "Are you ready to go riding?" Vivian nodded. Gregory got his jacket, put the axe back, told Old Mullins to carry on if he wished, but that Gregory was going, and then Gregory and Vivian walked over to the stables. Getting D'Artagnan ready was a quick matter. Gregory had actually wanted to take another one of the horses, but D'Artagnan saw Vivian and would have none of it. Either she would ride him, or he would take the stall apart. Vivian was frightened by the horse's willful display of temper, but Gregory assured her that D'Artagnan would be docile as a lamb as soon as they got the saddle on him, and that was exactly what happened. They walked the horse outside, and then Gregory put his arms around Vivian. "Are you ready?" he asked her. "Not yet," she replied, and when she blushed, he became certain that her desire to be held outweighed her fear of getting up on the horse. He held her for another moment, then leaned forward and whispered in her ear to be brave, and lifted her up into the saddle. Then he swung himself up behind her and put his arm about her. To do it now that he knew how much they both liked it made it seem like a different experience than last time, when it had at least seemed innocent at the start. He leaned forward to grab the reins, and she was everywhere in front of him, better than any memory. Why even bother with memories? Nothing could be better than her warm reality. "Where to?" he asked her softly, his emotions making it difficult to speak. "Take me where you want to go," she replied equally softly, and her hand closed about his sleeve. He felt the tug on his heart before he felt the tug on the fabric. "Your wish is my command, Princess," he said, and off they went, D'Artagnan moving them swiftly across the lawn and then through the trees. Everything with Vivian was like doing it for the first time, Gregory realized. The sunlight fell on them as if there had never been a day so fine. They rode out of the trees and across the road, and he thought this was the most scenic view he had ever seen. The very thrill of riding was a new thing that he could feel through her exhilarated limbs, and being with her like this was something that the two of them had just discovered. Any fear that Vivian felt quickly dissipated, and he could sense her happiness even without her speaking the words. They rode on, and it became a magical ride that Gregory never forgot. Each step forward stepping into his memory, past the boundary of where his recollection became so porous, backward into the rich layers of his distant past, and with all the sharpness of a childhood memory. As they rode, he spoke to her in his mind, telling her over and over what he could not yet say to her out loud where she could actually hear it, that he loved her, that he would always love her just like this, that his heart was hers. He hoped that, like him, she could hear his thoughts, and that they would further increase her happiness in the moment. D'Artagnan shared their delight and brought his best nature to the afternoon, being both obedient and high-spirited by turns. They reached another open space, and Gregory let him gallop, which made Vivian's heart race. Of course, there were also everyday pleasantries in the world, but they paled compared to this, a vibrant existence, unlike anything that a usual day had to offer. Gregory was entranced. They rode on and on. After a long while, Gregory jumped down and tied D'Artagnan to a nearby tree. Then he reached his arms up and gathered Vivian carefully like some crushable blossom and set her down beside him. She let herself fall forward into his arms, forcing him to catch her, and here where there was no one but the wind and D'Artagnan to see them, he let her do it. He let himself fold her into an embrace, the first such embrace ever, unless you could count the one at the Columns Hotel, which you almost couldn't, since he had been so terrified. Now he trusted himself more with her, he realized. He was worried for a moment where exactly it was that she planned to take this embrace, but she remained contentedly nestled against him and did not move. When at last, after a long time, he unwound his arms from her, she sighed happily, looked up at him, and smiled. "I want to do this every single day," she said. "Why do we ever have to go back?" "You sound like me, dear one, irrational and stubborn. Where is my practical Vivian?" he said playfully. "She is back in New Orleans, sewing her eyes out and her fingers off," Vivian replied. "Oh, good," he said. "Well, as long as I have this impractical nymph instead, let us go into the forest and live like creatures of the woods." He reached for her dainty hand, another first, and he pulled her with him into the sun-dappled shade. They walked together into the cool of the trees, going step by step into a more intimate world than the fully sunlit one that they were leaving behind. "There is a stream here somewhere," he told her. They walked on a bit further, and there it was, a small stream. "Do you think I might take my shoes off and get my feet wet?" she asked. "Well, maybe for a moment, but I wouldn't exactly dangle them there for long. You never know about the gators," he told her. She sat down on the bank and removed her shoes and stockings. Then she dipped her small white feet in the water. She picked up a small pebble, apparently thought about throwing it in, but then thought the better of it and slipped it into her pocket. He came up behind her, pulled her hair to one side, and chastely kissed the edge of her cheek by her ear. "You really do look like a wood nymph," he murmured. "I can see your butterfly wings coming out of your back, like in a picture of a fairy." "No, you are the one with wings," she corrected him. Then she pulled her feet out of the water, and he sat down beside her, and the two of them watched the stream. "What did you want to be as a boy?" she asked him after a while. "A hero," he readily replied. "I quickly learned how to ride well. Then I purchased a long cape and learned to twirl it, and at last I took up the art of swordsmanship. You can rest assured that if anyone ever tries to do you any injury, I am well set up to protect you, like a champion of old. Well, and then I grew up, and discovered there was little need for such heroes as you find in melodramatic novels. And I stopped dreaming about that as much." "And now what do you dream of?" she asked him. "About sitting with you on my sofa, with my hands in your hair," he admitted. "Why pretend otherwise?" "Nothing wrong with that," she said, looking at him as if dreaming of it right then and there. "As a matter of fact, I dream of that too." "The other benefit of being on my sofa is that it is much softer to sit on," he said, standing up again. "There must be somewhere more comfortable to sit than here." He looked around and noticed a wide fallen tree trunk. "Here, grab your shoes and stockings and hold on," he said. He lifted her up in his arms and carried her over to the horizontally positioned fallen tree trunk, where she turned to face the other way and draped her legs over it. "I want to look in this direction," she said. "Nice trees over here." "Suit yourself. I want to look at the stream," he said, just as stubborn. She moved closer to him, so close that her arm was pressed against his, and so they sat, looking away into opposite directions. There was the sound of a bird, then some distant rustling, and then there was silence, just the pouring down of warm sunlight in between the trees. Through her arm, he could feel her chest rise and fall with each breath. Time stopped. They had reached their magical destination when striving and desire seemed to lose all hold over them, and where things were perfect, just as they were. It was an interesting kind of separate togetherness, thought Gregory, one where each of them was looking elsewhere, and yet they were somehow also sharing the same experience. It was more than closeness. It was overlap. They sat silently for a long time. "These woods are so beautiful. I wish my mother and I had a garden," Vivian said at last. "It would be wonderful to be able to plant things and to watch them grow. Have you ever done any gardening?" "No, I have not, and I very much doubt whether I would have any talent for it," Gregory replied. "Wolf only made the mistake once of asking me to watch over his house plants. Now he hires someone to come and water things for him when he goes away. Apparently some of his plants were never the same after a week of my care." "Well, that is probably because of your bad memory," suggested Vivian. "Mostly, yes. I do forget to water things for days and days at a time, and then I try to compensate by overwatering. I'm rather unreliable as a rain god to dependent house plants," he confessed. "My mother, who was a very refined lady, as you know, had a gardener that she worked with to create a majestic flower garden. The crowning glory of her garden was her rose collection, and chief among them were her lavender-colored roses. When they bloomed, there were enough blossoms to bring indoors as cut flowers, and they filled vases throughout the house. I cannot look at a pale purple rose without thinking of my mother and my childhood. I used to play in that garden while she and the gardener discussed their plans, and then she would sometimes talk to me about all the types of flowers and the language of flowers. Do you know that many of the flowers stand in as symbols for something else? Vivian shifted around on the tree trunk to look at him. You mean the way that the red rose stands for love? Yes, exactly. So in this way, the daisy stands for innocence, the violet stands for faithfulness, and the lily stands for purity, he explained. Well, at least I think so. I may have all those mixed up, of course, but you get my meaning. Is there a flower that stands for our kind of friendship? Asked Vivian. Well, I imagine there must be. Now let me see. I don't know. Perhaps phlox? I think that one represents harmony and true friendship of the soul. United souls, if you will. Which reminds me, someone just told me that Aristotle said friendship was one soul, living in two bodies, or something like that. Do you believe that that is possible? Vivian thought about it for a moment. I cannot say for sure. I just know that I would find it easier to believe in something like that now than before I met you. What do you think? Oh, I think it really exists. The universe is a strange place and full of things that I might once not have believed in. I also lost a lot of my faith in the world over the years, but now I look at you and I really do want to believe. He reached out his hand, and his fingers found their way into her hair. Vivian, you are my most beautiful religion, he said to her, in a low and quiet voice, and he felt her heart start to hammer in her chest. They were silent again for a while, and then Vivian asked him, What did you mean when you said that your fear comes between us at times? What is it that you are afraid of? Gregory almost choked. To be in this vulnerable moment when his heart was so achingly reaching out for her, and then to have her ask him this question without any preamble at all, what could he possibly hope to say in reply? Vivi, please, it is wonderful to be with you, but it is also difficult for me. Can you appreciate that? He knew as he said it that this made it sound like something else, like something she probably wanted to hear, and he hated himself for it, but he did not know what else to say instead. Well, he might as well take it all the way toward flattery then. What did he have to lose? You are so beautiful, he told her, and I'm never certain just how good of a man I really wish to remain. But I don't want... you are far too young and... I understand, replied Vivian in a disappointed tone. I'm a child to you. Well, yes, you are, he said, relieved to be back on firm soil with her again. This much was certainly true. She did not appear very happy to hear this. But I am not a child. I am only 11 years younger than you. That is not so very much. Well, even that is almost 3/4 of your life up until now, he replied gently. Is that nothing? I'm grown up for my age. My mother always says I am more of a little adult than she was at my age. I do not think that someone's age is the only thing that should count. Age is a number. What your life experiences have been should also count for something, she said. And he realized that she was arguing with him. Oh, little girl, he thought. You want to talk about life experiences and compare who has lived through more. Yes, age is more than a number. But whatever way you want to keep score, I have you beat at this game. You have no idea, young, tender, innocent Vivian. My love, you really have no idea." "That may be," was all he said to her. "Well, we should get back, don't you think? D'Artagnan is probably getting restless." She put her stockings and shoes back on, and they walked out of the trees together. D'Artagnan was glad to see them return. Vivian patted his side, and then as Gregory came over to lift her up into the saddle, she stopped him and put her small hands on his upper arms as if she meant to hold him in place that way. "I meant what I said when I came over that evening from the bar," she said in a small voice, her eyes looking somewhere at the center of his chest. "I do love you, Gregory, truly and with all my heart." He felt his heart climb up into his throat. What to say? And if he found the right words, could he even utter them? It seemed a hopeless thing to try and remain reticent still after this declaration. There was no doubt that she meant it. He reached out a hand and cupped it against the back of her neck, pulling her head close to his shoulder. He held her for a while before speaking, feeling the fragility of her against his fingers. "Vivi, you have no idea what kind of a sorry mess my life was before you came into it," he told her. "Losing everyone, and then all those years of unhappiness. Before you came, I sat in that apartment and cut myself off from almost everything. Wolf and the book repair shop were my only bridge to the wider world. Guilt over the accident last summer drove me to visit you in the hospital. The certainty that you were the child I had once known kept me there. And now, knowing you better and feeling you as a part of my own self makes me want to stay close. What I mean to say, beautiful one, is that my heart is yours if you will have it. If someone like me can offer a princess like you anything at all. We were always meant to meet. I sometimes think that we were poured from one single cosmic egg. There is so much we have in common." He pulled back to look at her face. "I look at you and can see where our continents drifted apart from the same single ancient landmass, can sense all of the places where we connect together. It is for me a subtle alchemy of adoration." His voice trailed off. Vivian gently shook in his arms as if a breeze had blown past. Droplets of tears appeared on her cheek. "If you were ever eloquent," she breathed. "I weep, and I love you, and I am yours, and you have made me thus." And in that moment, Gregory's heart surrendered, completely and without any future recourse, surrendered in the way it had never done for anyone before. For someone to know the language of his heart and be able to speak it fluently, to quote Cyrano to him like this, it filled him with a holy fire for her. His heart began making silent vows to her, as he had done when she had been asleep in his arms. But now she was awake, and that made it feel different. She raised her eyes up to look at him, and without even thinking of the risk, without even thinking at all, he closed them by covering her eyelids and eyelashes with kisses. He could taste the salt of her tears as she trembled against him, fighting this emotional gale that caught them both in its fierce winds. With one hand still in her hair and the other on her shoulder blade, he possessively pulled her so close that they could not have come closer unless she had actually fused with his person or moved through him. Her small hands held on to him firmly. This was why, his heart told him. Everything you always wondered about, why your life turned out the way it did. This was why. So that one day you could be here in this one moment with her. We are passing into uncharted territory, he thought, and I cannot stop it, and it is frightening and irresistible at the same time. My soul hangs on your every word and gesture like a dewdrop clings to a leaf. One sudden movement and you've sent it rolling down from its delicately balanced perch. Run all over the world, he thought to himself. You can run pretty fast, Gregory. Run and look for something that looks like this, that feels like this, that hurts this much, that feels this wonderful and full of life, that trembles when you breathe on it, that changes colors when you hold it up to the sun like a prism through which your entire life passes as if in an instant. Run and see if you can catch this elusive thing and tame it and make it do your bidding. You cannot. It is like an unexplainable work of magic that no one can control, but that yet you can clearly see. There is nowhere that you're going to find something like this. It is the only thing like it in the world. They stood and held each other for a long time, until D'Artagnan tried to poke his head in between them, and they remembered he was there, and that they were still in this world. Vivian looked elated, as if waking from a wonderful dream, but then she rapidly became crestfallen. "What is the matter, dear one?" asked Gregory, keeping his arms closed about her shoulders. "I don't want to go home. I don't ever want to be away from you again. I don't want to be without you, even for a day. I want to wake in the night and have you there with me, and each day I want to stay with you, and I never want you to be more than an arm's reach away," she said, with longing and pain audible in her voice. "Vivy, be reasonable," he told her, smoothing a hand over her sun-warmed hair. "You are still very young. There is a time for what you suggest, and there is a time to still enjoy the end of your childhood and to be with your mother. Do not race ahead of yourself. There is no reason to hurry. I will be here. I will wait for you. I will be with you always, in one way or another. And I tell you truly, I will never belong to another woman." "You will always stay with me?" she asked, wiping at the tears sliding down her cheeks. "Always. Come what may," he told her. "I, too, pray that there will come a time when we will be together forevermore, in perfect unison of love and friendship that you also dream of. I want to believe in it, Vivy, and I do not want to take any risks that could jeopardize that future. I want your mother to believe in my decency as a man. I want to prove myself to your heart, and to live up to my own expectations of myself, and I want to go from this point forward with sure steps towards you, doing what is right, and treating you with dignity, and showing you that I hold you higher in my heart than all other things. Come now, let's ride together. I would have you close." And with that, he untied D'Artagnan, lifted Vivian up into the saddle, and swung himself up behind her. "It feels like you belong there," she sighed contentedly, seeming to speak of both innocent longing and adolescent stirrings at the same time. "I do belong here," he murmured into her warm hair, winding his arm around her and grabbing the reins with his other hand. The sensation now of her sitting so close filled him with a remembered heat in his limbs, not unlike that which he had known as a boy, becoming a man, when he could still not fully yet control his passions. "Oh, Vivian," he thought, "my younger self would not have been so forbearing. We would be rolling through the tall grass by now and discarding clothing. But now I want more than that with you, and I also want to deserve you." They rode back across the grass, then through the trees, and along the path they had taken earlier in the day, and their sense of togetherness hung over them like a blessing. At one place they took a different turn than they had on their ride up, and when she asked, Gregory explained to her that they were going to the promised nearby estate sale to see if there were any good books for Wolf. "I did not realize that there was an actual estate sale," said Vivian. "Tell the truth whenever possible, remember?" Gregory reminded her. Vivian nodded. They rode on until they reached the old country home where the sale was being held. Gregory tied up D'Artagnan, and then he reached for Vivian's small hand as they walked in together. A couple of loud dogs ran up to them, then stopped abruptly when they got close enough to Gregory to smell him, and then they all began growling. Oh, the bothersomeness of it all. Gregory showed his teeth and growled back. "Does that work?" asked Vivian dubiously, hiding fearfully behind Gregory's back. "It does when I do it," he replied. The dogs turned and fled. "Come, let us see what they have inside." There were many items for sale, mostly furniture and old household items, and the collection of books was small. Gregory picked out 2 that he thought Wolf might want to resell, and then he paid for them, and they rode away again. Their different path home brought them through the trees and past the empty, overgrown foundations of Temps le Désiré. "Oh, there is that beautiful large old tree," Vivian cried, "and the foundations of Temps le Désiré." It seemed to him as if she, too, could see what was no longer visible. The manor house as it had once been, the alley of trees leading up to it, the white pillars and long 2-story porch that had been its crowning glory. "I can see it too," he wanted desperately to whisper to her, but there was too much suffering and sadness moving through his heart to say anything out loud. This close to home, Gregory no longer needed to use the reins, leaving both of his hands free. Unable to stop touching her, he brought his other arm up to her right shoulder and leaned forward into the fragrant curtain of her hair. They rode on slowly to the farm like this, and then, somehow still faster than either of them would have wished it, they were at the stables, and it was time to climb down. "Not yet," she whispered, and Gregory happily held her close for another few minutes, until at last D'Artagnan, confused about why they were at the stables but not going in, tried to ride into the building with them on his back. Gregory jumped down, pulled Vivian down, and then they both set about taking care of the horse and bringing him water and fresh hay and removing his saddle and bridle. Gregory was relieved to see that, in the shift of focus to the care of the horse, Vivian's disappointment at having been peeled away from Gregory's body was lessened. "Think what you want, Wolf," he thought, but she is still more of a child, transparent in her joys and her desires. Her innocence is so apparent, only someone blind could fail to see it. Vivian moved around the stable with enthusiasm and diligence, eager to learn where she did not know what needed to be done, and very soon they had everything in place. Gregory pulled out his pocket watch. "I think maybe we should ride back into New Orleans together on the train. What do you think? Then we could stop by the store and deliver Wolf his books before taking you home. I will get us a car at the station, then it will all go faster. What do you say?" His plan met with enthusiasm. Vivian thrilled at the idea of riding back with him, even if they agreed to briefly separate when they reached the station, just in case anyone in Madame Pravet's acquaintance happened to see them. He told her to wait outside while he went into his cottage to gather his things, chiefly his small travel bag with his journal and pen in it. He walked in and looked down at his bed, and his breath caught in his throat. She had been lying in it. He could see from the crushed covers. In fact, it looked as if she had lain down and moved her arms and legs to create an angel shape on his blanket. He felt a saintly rush of tenderness for her come over him, justifying and reinforcing every one of his nobler impulses. He came back out with the books for Wolf and his one small bag, and with Vivian's skirt, which he grabbed and ran into the cottage to change into, and then they both hurried over the lawn to say goodbye to the Mullins, and to ask old Mullins if he would drive them to the station. The train arrived almost on time, a rare thing. They climbed on board and waved to old Mullins through the window, and then, as the train pulled away from the station, Vivian looked up at Gregory and said, "This is the best day that I have ever had in my entire life." "I quite understand. I feel the same way," he replied. And then they sat down across from each other in the compartment and smiled at one another as if at some private jest known only to the two of them.